Dobar dan svima i hvala vam na prisustvu. Ja sam Ermina Kuloglija, novinarka Balkanske istraživačke mreže Bosne i Hercegovine i bit ću moderatorica današnjeg webinara. Prije samog uvoda već sam naglasila na početku za osobe koje pričaju engleskim jezikom, zamolit ću vas da u donjem desnom uglu tokom ovog webinara izaberete prijevod koji vam je potreban. Dakle, sa bosanskog na engleski ili sa engleskog na bosanski. To je ova mala ikonica u obliku planete Zemlje, odnosno globusa. Također, sva pitanja tokom panela, sugestije ili bilo kakve komentare možete pisati na chat ili u box Q&A. Dakle, dobrodošli na drugi po redu webinar Razgovori stručnjaka, globalni razgovori o regrutiranju, radikalizaciji i novim prijetnjama, koji se realizira u sklopu projekta istraživanje o negativnim efektima recipročne radikalizacije, financijski podržanog od ambasade Kraljevine Norveške u Bosni i Hercegovini, a u organizaciji Atlantske inicijative. Atlantska inicijativa kao takva je bosansko-hercegovačka nevladina organizacija koja je poznata po istraživanjima fokusiranim upravo na ova pitanja, na sigurnosna pitanja, koja istražuje teme radikalizacije, nasilnog ekstremizma i terorizma. Budući da unutar organizacije djeluje Odjeljenje za ravnopravnost spolova, oni također sarađuju na ovim temama. Tako smo na prošlom webinaru mogli razgovarati sa stručnjacima o temama online radikalizacije, kreiranja propagande za privlačenje novih članova, ali i ženskim pripadnicama desničarskih skupina. Današnji webinar pod nazivom Trenutne prijetnje i novonastali trendovi bit će pak posvećen temama koje se tiču kreiranja krajnje desničarskih paravojnih formacija u Ukrajini, potom sigurnosnim aspektima povratnika iz Sirije i Iraka, ali i geopolitici desnice i utjecaju Ukrajine na globalnu desnicu. Obzirom na dinamiku Bosne i Hercegovine, ona zapravo predstavlja na neki način idealno okruženje za razvoj ovakvih tema, te ćemo se u diskusiji, odnosno nakon diskusije, pozabaviti time kako ova pitanja, odnosno ove teme se zapravo tiču, odnosno dotiču Bosne i Hercegovine. Dakle, o stanju svega ovoga govorit ćemo u diskusiji nakon izlaganja naših panelista i panelistica i u razgovoru sa diskutantima i diskutanticama, te ću ih sa zadovoljstvom predstaviti onim redom kojim će zapravo i govoriti. Naš prvi panelista je Michael Colborn, novinar čiji je rad fokusiran na krajnju desnicu u srednjoj i istočnoj Evropi, sa posebnim interesom za transnacionalni radikalni desničarski ekstremizam. Tema razgovora bit će krajnja desnica i Ukrajina. Diskutant je Denis Đidić, direktor Balkanske istraživačke mreže Bosne i Hercegovine. U drugom dijelu razgovora pak dekan Fakulteta političkih nauka, profesor Saad Turčalo, razgovarat će sa doktoricom Asijom Metodijevom, istraživačicom na Institutu za međunarodne odnose u Pragu, o temi Sirija i strani borci, dok ćemo u trećem dijelu razgovora sa profesorom doktorom Antonom Čekovcovom, direktorom Centra za demokratski integritet, koji je vanjski istraživač na Švedskom institutu za međunarodne poslove, govoriti o temi geopolitika krajnje desnice i Rusije, a razgovor će voditi profesorica sigurnosnih studija na Univerzitetu u Sarajevu, Edina Bećirović. Kao što sam već rekla, nakon ova 3 razgovora uslijedit će diskusija. Vrijeme predviđeno za vaša pitanja i komentare. Još ću jednom napomenuti, prevod je u donjem desnom uglu. Sva pitanja i komentare, molim vas, koristite chat ili box Q&A. Hvala vam još jednom na prisustvu. Ja ću sada prepustiti riječ Denisu Đidiću.
Thank you very much, Nadmina. My name is Denis Đidić. I'm the executive director of BIRN in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now, BIRN is a pretty large NGO media working across the Western Balkans, but in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we're focused on 3 different subjects. So the first one is transitional justice and all of its manifestations. The second one is extremism and terrorism in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So we are covering all of the trials of foreign terrorist fighters. We're doing investigations about about the far right and Islamist ideologies. And the final one segment that we cover is the rule of law. Now, in regards to today's topic, we're going to be talking about the far right and Ukraine. And if you follow the mainstream media and a lot of the coverage in the Western Balkans, you will probably have a conclusion that that's not a huge issue and that kind of connection is not particularly clear. And you would think that ethno-nationalism and especially Islamist ideologies, extreme ones, are a more pressing problem. However, we have seen a rise of really in-depth investigations that are uncovering that far-right neo-Nazi groups are operating in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and especially the entire region, Serbia and Croatia, and that some of them are, they have very, very strong connections to international groups and are drawing their ideology in a lot of senses from the Ukraine. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be talking about that with Michael Colborn, who is a journalist specializing in radical right movements in Central and Eastern Europe. So basically his current work especially focuses on the international connections of these groups. He's written in detail about the far right in Ukraine, both as a freelance journalist and also working as a contributing member for Bellingcat. So his articles about Ukraine's far right have explored the Azov movement's international connections, their ideological roots, other neo-Nazi groups of Russian origin, and manifestos. He's also worked on several investigations for BIRN, which we're going to touch on now. Michael, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Now, what I want to start with, in order to be as contemporary as possible, is to tell people, because some may not know, that a big story breaking out in Bosnia in the past month has been that the police is actually searching for a man called Robert Rando, who is one of the founders of a US-based far-right organization called the Rise Above movement. He entered Bosnia and Herzegovina last month, and this is he entered Bosnia and Herzegovina from Serbia, from where he was expelled. Basically, why Robert Rando is problematic, because he's accused of physically assaulting people who were rallying against the former US President Donald Trump in California in 2017. Bellingcat reported in 2020 that he was living in several European countries, and while in Serbia, he was recording videos with far-right messages. So it's extremely interesting that he was visiting both Serbia and is now in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Problematically, and this is kind of an issue that manifests how Bosnia and Herzegovina is tackling these far-right and neo-Nazi issues, we've let him enter the country, and the police has pretty much no idea where he is at this time. So as someone who's looked at the international connections of Robert Rando and also written about his visits to Ukraine, could you give us a little bit of context of why this is problematic, and what is it symptomatic of that a person of this profile is visiting, recording these messages in the region of the Western Balkans?
Well, with Mr. Rando, I think in the first place, he's an example of a far-right extremist from the West, broadly conceived, the West, American obviously, who, after getting into some legal trouble in 2017 and into 2018, and eventually, I won't go into insane detail about it, but a court case against him was thrown out, and he ended up leaving the United States to to basically try to form networks or build a new base for himself in Eastern Europe. So he was first on the kind of international or transnational far-right radar in 2017, 2018, when he had spent time in Ukraine. But what happened in sort of early 2020 is that while people like me at the time expected that he would, go back to Ukraine and build that connection there that he seemed to have there, he ended up spending more time in Southeastern Europe. He was at I know he was at these events because I was at these events too, covering them. He was at, in February 2020, a neo-Nazi event in Budapest in Hungary. And then 2 weeks later, he was at a similar event in Sofia in Bulgaria. It was very clear at that point that he was trying to network with some of these far-right or outright neo-Nazi organizations across some of these countries. And soon after that, it became clear that as the COVID-19 pandemic, as we all know, started wreaking havoc on all our lives and on international travel in March 2020, he ended up posting a video from the Knyaz Mihaila Street here in Belgrade in Serbia. And over the summer of 2020, a few journalists and other people were, kind of following his posts on Telegram, his attempts to network, his attempts to propagandize, particularly around things related to Black Lives Matter in the United States. Later in the year, when I started looking into him in more detail, it became painfully clear, very obvious, that he was trying to build a new base for himself in Serbia, in Belgrade. And so I wrote a fairly, I've written larger investigations, a fairly brief and to the point investigation, just using, it was fairly straightforward, using, open source methods online, posts he'd made on social media, connecting a few dots together. And at that point, with that investigation, I didn't think, I thought it would, maybe garner a few headlines, and a few people might pay attention for a day or two about why this American neo-Nazi was building a base in Serbia. But this was in November 2020. I was pleasantly surprised, I suppose, to find that a lot of Serbian media and regional media in the Western Balkans, not just in Serbia, Rundo's presence and the investigation, the Bellingcat investigation, really blew up, and it really garnered a lot of attention for a lot of people asking that question: what is this violent neo-Nazi guy from the United States doing in this country? And a few months after that, I believe, like Dennis said, I think it was maybe in February, when he reportedly got expelled from Serbia, and strangely enough, into Bosnia. So I presume that what happened is that, thanks at least in part to some of the work that I did, and then it being followed up on much more as well by local and regional media, is that I think Serbian authorities realized that this individual, Mr. Rundo, who was trying to organize and network with similar-minded people in Serbia and beyond, they just realized he was a liability and they didn't want him in the country, so they punted him out into Bosnia. So as far as what he's doing now in Bosnia, I think I've realized this particularly over the past several weeks, is that with being ejected from Serbia and hanging out somewhere in Bosnia, we don't know, his activities online have really been curtailed. The level of, say, propagandizing or videos that he used to make are next to non-existent. I think getting ejected from the country where he was trying to make a new base, getting sent into one where he clearly did not have a network or a base, has really hampered his activities. And I think with Mr. Rundo, it's an example on the one hand of, a lot of times with the work that I do on the transnational far right, I don't actually like to focus too much on individuals. I prefer to look at movements and broader factors that bring some of these things into play. But sometimes there are people who get a profile and have at least some skill or willingness to try to organize and network similar-minded people. So, but on the other hand, I think what we should realize with Mr. Rundo is that he, to put it politely, is, compared to other far-right activists, far-right extremists, the whole the whole broad spectrum of people on the far right, compared to all of those individuals, Robert Rundo is, shall we say, is not the smartest or savviest guy around. And I think he made a lot of mistakes in basically exposing himself and saying too much, in being too provocative, and that got too much attention, and now he's feeling the consequences of it. And the reason I want to point that out is because I feel that what Rundo's example can teach, all of us in whichever countries we're in Central and Eastern Europe, Western Balkans, and beyond, is that the next time that there's an individual like this who maybe comes in from another country to organize and propagandize, they might have learned from his mistakes, and they might be smarter and more savvy, and thus more dangerous.
Thanks for that. You spoke about networks of people from the region and from the Ukraine, and that is not the only example of extremist ideologies being networked in the region, and that being connected to the Ukraine. Since 2014, with the annexation of Crimea, the conflict in the Ukraine, we have seen obviously a large number of volunteers from the region going to fight in this conflict. From Bosnia and Herzegovina, we have confirmation of more than a dozen people, but the number is probably larger. From Serbia, it's dozens, and we have seen a large amount of prosecutions in these cases. And worryingly, with recent events from the Ukraine, again with mobilization of armies being involved, we have seen chatters online, and something that Björn investigated and published and reported on. We have seen these networks come alive again. We are seeing chatter from Chetnik movements, from people involved from 2014 with bringing people to fight it as volunteers in Ukraine in the conflict. Again, being somewhat more active online and speaking about the need to come and fight and be involved in this conflict. Can you give us a background about how many people from the region, from the Western Balkans, especially Bosnia, fought in this conflict, on which sides they were involved, and what is really known about these groups and these individuals? How problematic were they generally?
Well, with the issue of foreign fighters going to Ukraine, particularly from the Western Balkans, the research I've seen, I believe, suggests that from Croatia, there might have been up to around 60 or more foreign fighters who went to the pro-Ukrainian side. And to be clear with these numbers, these are not all members of the far right or people affiliated to the far right. These are overall foreign fighter numbers. So to what extent is everybody within that group somebody affiliated with the far right? It could be half, it could be higher, it could be less. In that sense, we don't really know. But from Croatia, on the for the Ukrainian side, there were about 60 from the numbers I've seen. I believe this is all happening like 2014 and 15. I believe maybe a dozen, perhaps less, went to fight with the then Azov battalion, now our regiment. In Serbia, I think, as you alluded to, Dennis, there were, from the numbers I've seen, maybe around 100 Serbs who went to fight for the pro-Russian, or say Russian-backed side in Eastern Ukraine. And so that, like you said, includes far right, includes nationalist Chetniks groups and all sorts of individuals like that. And in Bosnia, as you mentioned, I think, at least I found with some of trying to look into this a bit late last year, and I think you alluded to it as well, some of those numbers are a bit foggy. Like, if there may be a handful, a dozen maybe who went from Republika Srpska to go fight on to fight on the Russian backside, and perhaps Bosnian Croats, like their compatriots in next door in Croatia, who may have had some role on the Ukrainian side. So those are with some of the other countries in the region. I believe they're small handful of numbers, like literally less than 5, or a few other really smaller accounts from every country. But I think what's interesting is that the issue of foreign fighters really kind of rose to the forefront, at least in Western media coverage, about 2 years ago. And I mean, I looked into some of this stuff as well, and my the Resonant Voices Fellowship that I did for Byrne 2 years ago touched on the issue of Croatian foreign fighters as well. But even at that point, it was kind of old news to people. The fact that a lot of foreigners, far-right extremists, had gone to fight in Ukraine on both sides was already well-trodden territory by 2015. I think what did definitely change in 2019 were the Christchurch terror attacks and other instances of far-right extremist terrorism that really got a lot of Western and a lot of American eyes really looking to Ukraine. And I think there's still, as far as that sort of overarching question of, what threat do these former foreign fighters in Ukraine pose to their home countries, that's still pretty under-researched at this point. I know there's one very good researcher who's just starting to write a book on the topic right now, and I think he's sort of at the forefront of really quite adroitly understanding this on both sides. So with that, the only thing that I think could change the dynamic would be some sort of escalation, severe escalation in eastern Ukraine. And obviously that has been some of the worry in the last few weeks. It seems to have calmed down a bit, I stress a bit, but with increased worries and chatter about further Russian incursion, even a Russian invasion, however unlikely that may be, but at the very least, more escalation of Russian activities in Ukraine. You saw as you at Byrne investigated, I thought that was really quite worrisome, but quite useful to know that there were for the Russian-backed side, that there were former foreign fighters trying to organize to get some of these potential foreign fighters back to Ukraine to fight on that Russian-backed side, if and when the war kicked off even more again. And also you saw this, I believe these arrests were last week in the Czech Republic, these Russian-backed Czechoslovak, I forget the exact title, of soldiers in reserve, sort of name like that. I apologize for not knowing the exact name offhand, but a Russian-backed group that fought in eastern Ukraine, who from the get-go were always interested in, at least ostensibly, to go back to their home country and do some measure of terror or violence. So on the one hand, we're still trying to understand, I think, the potential threat that foreign fighters who have been in Ukraine might pose. And obviously there's I think there's two poles on this. There's one, we can look and say, okay, there really haven't been any terror attacks or any plots or anything like that, save for these Czechoslovak soldiers in reserve and a few other isolated incidents of things like that. So on the one hand, people might want to say, oh, well, these foreign fighters from both sides don't pose a threat at all. Why are we even talking about them or worrying about them? Versus the other pole, the other extreme, which is sort of seeing these foreign fighters as sort of taking a frame from Syria and trying to plop it down onto Ukraine and treat foreign fighters coming back from Ukraine as the equivalent of like ISIS fighters who are hell-bent on terrorism, and that they're everybody who comes back is a potential terrorist. I think that's the other extreme as well. I mean, to what extent does the reality lie between that? I'm not entirely sure myself. I don't think we should overstate the threat that some of these individuals, current or future, depending on what happens, shouldn't overstate the threat that some of these individuals might have. But on the other hand, I don't think we should ignore it entirely altogether. I also think it's important to, I've really felt this over the past year or two, as a lot of Western coverage has focused a lot on terrorism, on far-right terrorism, has focused on, like I alluded to, trying to take this model of understanding of jihadism in Syria and the context of ISIS, taking that context and understanding and kind of plopping it down onto Ukraine and expecting things to work the same way. And it very much doesn't. So one of the things that I focus on is something that I would stress is we shouldn't excessively, I guess, securitize the issue of the far rights across Europe and including in Ukraine to focus just on potential far right terrorism. What concerns me in a medium to longer term, even if it doesn't explicitly include violence, is networking, is building strength, is sharing resources, sharing ideologies, and in building and strengthening some of those existing networks. That's the kind of thing I focus on. And I do worry that if we focus too much on terror, we risk missing a lot of what like an iceberg is sort of lying underneath there.
Just before your question, I will, there is one remark I would like, there is only 15 more minutes for your discussion, so please be aware of it.
Okay.
Thank you. That's really interesting because it's a great segue to my next question, because you mentioned that the international connections of these groups are very important, and not just foreign fighters, but also political affiliations. And we know that the Azov movement is now also, it has a political manifestation of how it's acting. And you were involved in a report, in an investigation that actually Nermina worked on from Bosnia and Herzegovina, which showed that a group of football hooligans who were actually involved in the same group of football fans were involved in some small rioting in Mostar a couple of days back, were drawing their inspiration from Azov, and we've using open source evidence also managed to map a few of these members that are using the same symbols on their tattoos that are actually going to the Ukraine and visiting there. Now, as someone who's looked into obviously Azov, can you explain, what does this group actually mean for far-right groups across Europe, and why is this important and potentially worrisome for Bosnia?
I think what's quite interesting about the way that Azov is perceived by the far right internationally is that there is still so much, I guess, mythology around what Azov is, and I'm saying this comes from the far right. There, as I regularly look through, Telegram channels, other not so nice corners of the internet, in English, far removed from Ukraine, far removed from anywhere in Central and Eastern Europe, there are still people 7 years after the conflict started who are posting all this praise of Azov, but praise in terms of what they think they are, and also praise in terms of it, that they think that the reality is still such in Ukraine that as a foreign, far right person, a lot of them still feel that they can just randomly show up in Ukraine, join Azov, join some sort of far-right battalion, get a tiny bit of training, and then all of a sudden be out at the front fighting a real live war. And it hasn't worked that way for years, since 2015 at least. So I think what with the transnational far right, when they look at Azov, I think one, they see a bit of untruth or mythology behind it, but they see what they perceive as, and with some rightness, as an extensively well-organized, well-oiled far-right movement that is able to a significant degree to do what it wants in Ukraine, in its own country, without the kinds of repercussions that that similar far-right people might face in their own countries. So the foreign far-right still looks with some envy on Azov, but I stress this is part of the far-right that might be called or perceived as more pro-Ukraine. Now, of course, as Anton is, I know, going to discuss about the role of Russia, when it comes to members of the transnational far-right who are generally more sympathetic or allied to Russia, they see Azov as some sort of almost a group that's sold out in some ways. They see them as, kind of lackeys of the West, which is a bit strange. But they also, this is something that I know the movement had to fight against in trying to build networks across Europe, is people thinking that they had some sort of Jewish connection. Obviously, far-right people, neo-Nazis being neo-Nazis, the idea that oligarch Igor Kolomoisky may have had some financial role in developing what was then the Azov battalion, that at least for some of these maybe more Russian-leaning neo-Nazis was a black mark. So I think in general, and this certainly doesn't apply just to the far right, with Azov, the entire movement internationally, there's still so much mythology, there's still so much opaqueness surrounding how people understand it. I mean, that's partly why I'm writing a book on this movement, which I hope will offer some perspective on some of this that's lacking. But even that is not going to magically improve or increase understanding across the board of what this movement is. So.
And we just have 6 or 7 minutes, so I'm just gonna finish with this kind of question to keep it like contemporary, in the sense of where we are at this point is a year and on from the start of the pandemic, and a lot of these far-right movements, and Azov especially, as you've written about for Fair Observer, are being more and more involved in humanitarian activities or fake humanitarian activities. We've written about a group in Portugal, which also has pro-Russian connections, which is using this. In Serbia, we know Leviathan, we know other groups that are on the spectrum of the right that are using this methodology. And you've also written that Ukraine's Azov regiment and its political party, National Corps, are acting as well-organized far-right movements that are just lending a hand during the current COVID-19 crisis and taking advantage of this occasion for clever branding and public relations opportunities. And I wanted to ask you, could you tell us how this is actually being manifested in the region, and potentially what is the worry for us locally, how much more these groups are going to build up their membership, their PR, and how more threatening are they going to be? And again, that this is going to pass under the radar, because as we've written about in several occasions, really the issue of the far far right in Bosnia and Herzegovina is not really addressed at all, or anywhere near as close to other potential security threats on the spectrum of extreme ideologies. And please keep it within 5 or 6 minutes, so Nermina doesn't get very, very mad at us.
Well, I think it's really interesting. Here we are in April 2021, and looking back to March, April, May 2020, and that article that I wrote, you're alluding to, which talked about, which I wrote about how some far-right movements are taking advantage of the pandemic to try to kind of improve their own branding, as it were, to raise their profile, to kind of look like, hey, we're the ones stepping in to help you when the government isn't. What I've actually found interesting since then is that some of those efforts, they don't necessarily appear to have worked. I mentioned the Ukraine context, and that was where I did stress that in that article. What was interesting, that after I wrote that, within a few months, some of those, that called themselves volunteer corps, these activities that they were consciously doing, big branded activities they were consciously doing to kind of sort of attach their name to help during the pandemic, those really kind of fizzled out, and they disappeared, pretty much disappeared by the end of the summer. And some of the other examples, I think, from Western and Eastern Europe, I think a lot of these sorts of kind of PR branding activities related to the pandemic, they might still be going on haphazardly from different groups or different individuals. But the sense I get from the far right here in the region, in the Western Balkans, broader Central and Eastern Europe, and of course beyond that, is that some of these far right efforts to take advantage of the pandemic, I think maybe that's almost a direction for future research, because what I, in all honesty, was expecting to see, halfway through last year, that it didn't happen. I think what's happened is that I think some of these far right groups realized they were not getting the potential political capital out of these efforts that they had hoped. They weren't getting the attention or profile that they hoped from some of these activities. So in other words, they kind of maybe put in an quote unquote investment or literal investment in for a few months, realized they weren't getting quite the dividends out of it that they thought, and then just kind of scaled it back. I think this is something we all realize and can agree on, is that the pandemic has probably not gone the way that any of us expected at this time a year ago. I didn't think we'd be here more than a year later still, like when all of us panelists were chatting beforehand about various, lockdown measures in Vienna, in Sarajevo, and Belgrade, wherever else. I think what happened with that section of the far right that thought it could take advantage of it, I think it just became too much to deal with, and not enough benefit from trying to insert themselves into that discussion. Now, that being said, I think there are probably still going to be and have been opportunities for groups and individuals to look like they're stepping in, or to criticize their governments for being, unpatriotic or anti, insert country here. But I think for those far right groups and individuals that I would say, I guess, aren't necessarily conspiracist when it comes to COVID-19, I think that sort of avenue has dried up. Now, of course, there is the element of the far right in all of our countries that is explicitly conspiracist with COVID-19, that likes to spread disinformation, conspiracy theories. You see that in Serbia, particularly, with the anti-vaxxers allied with far right groups like Leviathan and Srpska Akcija. I remember seeing some of their ridiculous anti-vaccine stickers around Belgrade last year sometime. So I think for far right groups trying to exploit COVID-19, I think they have tried, but it has not been as beneficial as they think. And for those far right groups and individuals who still kind of want to insert themselves in the discussion, or want to try to gain some political capital from it. It's probably limited to criticism or efforts here or there that criticize particular authorities, and also getting full on into conspiracist anti-vaxxer stuff to try to appeal to that part of the population.
Thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you.
Just in conclusion, to say that you know, in all of these issues that we've discussed, these worrying trends are something that we are really hopeful to see you know, addressed in some way in Bosnia and Herzegovina's new draft of strategy that is aimed at combating extremism and terrorism. You know, we've had the last strategy that dealt with the period from 2015 to 2020. It ended, but you know, ever since we were almost a year from when this document is concluded, we do not have a new document, and it's one that most experts agree on should really incorporate kind of a strategic dealing with far right and the far right narrative and all of these issues in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So that's something that we will continue to monitor and look for. So thanks so much, Michael. And
well, thank you.
We'll end right here, and thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Denis and Michael. It was really a pleasure to listen to you. I'm looking forward to discussion. I suppose there will be many questions about this topic. Our next panelist is Dr. Asya Metodiyeva from Institute for International Relations from Prague. She'll be talking about Syria and foreign fighters, and discussant is Professor Sead Turčalo.
Dobar dan. Da, imam neki, sad se ok. Dobar dan svima. Ja sam Sead Turčalo, pored toga što radim na Fakultetu političkih nauka, jedan sam od članova tima Atlantske inicijative. Ja ću na uvodnom dijelu reći, prije nego što prijeđemo na samu diskusiju, nekoliko riječi o Atlantskoj inicijativi, čisto za ovaj publikum koji nije možda upoznat s radom. Radi se o organizaciji koja je fokusirana na različite istraživanja koja se tiču različitih aspekata sigurnosti, zatim istraživanja u oblasti prava, da tako kažemo, pravdi. Naši istraživači su među prvima, da kako prvi u regiji, a među prvima i u širom nekom regionalnom okviru napravili istraživanja o odlasku stranih ratnika na sirijsko ratište, Vlado Azinović, Muhamed Jusić. Prijedodno smo imali i studije koji se bavili tim specifičnim ideološkim okvirima u kojoj su se zapravo izrodile te grupe koje su bile spremne da odu na strana ratišta. To istraživanje radila kolegica Edina Bečirević. Isto tako inicijativa se naravno fokusira na druge varijacije radikalizma, te je realizirala i nekoliko istraživanja koji se tiču radikalne desnice. Meni je zadovoljstvo da danas razgovaram sa Asjom Metodijevom. Ja ću nekako naš razgovor fokusirati na neke ključne teme i njezinog istraživanja i onoga što će zasigurno interesirati publiku. Krenuo bi zapravo od samog tog radikalnog miljeja. Istraživanja koja su rađene i radi se i tekako napominju i primjećuju ulogu tog ratnog nasljeđa u kreiranju postratnih radikalnih miljeja na cijelom prostoru Zapadnog Balkana. Ono što bi ja zamolio Asiju, naravno to ako je u mogućnosti, budući da je ona manje više isključivo fokusirana na ovu, da, kako ja nazivam, ISIL inspiriranu radikalizaciju, na njeno istraživanje, da možda u tom kontekstu isto ti priče o postratnim radikalnim miljejima eventualno napravi neku vrstu i poveznice između i sljedbenika i influencira iz ovih ISIL inspirirane grupacije i onog što se dešava na ovom radikalnom desnom krilu. Ono što me zanima zapravo šta su tu neke identificirane sličnosti i razlike u formiranju tih postratnih radikalnih miljeja u regiji, odnosno u različitim zemljama regiji, i koje su tu implikacije. Ja bih krenuo sada s tim, a onda ćemo nekako razvijati našu diskusiju kao nekim fokusiranim mikro temama.
Thank you, Seat. Thank you to Professor Tucho for this introduction, for the summary of what I've been doing. First and foremost, to say that it's a great pleasure to be part of this discussion today and to meet people from Atlantic Initiative, because I've been following your work throughout the years, and it's been always the main guiding point when it comes to how advanced the research is on this topic in the region. Let me just go back to the beginning of my story or my engagement with this topic. When I started doing my field work and decided what is my topic of my PhD, the first question I was like very puzzled by from the literature was, okay, we talk about foreign fighters. There are foreign fighters from Belgium, from Switzerland, from Germany, from the Balkans. And basically the story in the Western literature was more or less the same. It was about individual triggers, individual motivations, or some sort of like ideology, which is pretty much top down, and everybody basically who has an access to social media has the potential to get radicalized, which is, you know, a very broad and very simplified and very simplistic assumption. So this is why I asked myself, okay, what is different about people coming from the Balkans? And what I decided that it's most interesting is about the context, is about the fact that we don't talk about immigrant communities like of someone who is trying to integrate themselves in the West, in wealthy society in Western Europe, which is one of the conventional arguments, and the integration failures, but it's about indigenous communities, it's about local population, it's about people who if have something in common is the legacy of recent conflicts in the region. And then, of course, I looked at what local researchers have been saying on this, and I find out that one of the arguments is that, right, there is a link to the conflicts through networks that appeared at that time, individuals who emerged as influential figures and then remained influential between, for instance, the Bosnian War and throughout the years until we reached the point to talk about foreign fighter mobilization in 2012 and 2016. So the question is, though, what is it about the war? Exactly. Is it the fact that it was a permissive factor for certain ideologies to appear? Is it about certain actors to become influential? And the way how I looked at this question was basically to think of these societies. There are like a couple of possible explanations. One way is to look at the Balkan societies as militarized societies, right? Societies in which we have like a greater, let's say, capacity to participate in wars due to the training or the experience of certain individuals. Then we can think of, let's say, a bigger amount of arms that are stocked in these societies. But then I was like thinking that if we look at the numbers of foreign fighters, it's about mostly different generation, in 90% of the cases, young people who didn't have any touch to the war from this point of view. Then we can take the ideological perspective and say, well, the ideology appeared in this period of time. And then due to this fact, we have this ideological legacy that has been persistent and survived until the Syrian war. But then this is still insufficient, because if we look at, this is not different, let's say, from the West, because this is also an argument that we can apply to the Western foreign fighters. And finally, what I find interesting as an explanation, and I would say that this is my argument, that radical influencers, as I call them, people who were behind the recruitment process of foreign fighters between 2012 and 2016, had the opportunity to become one of the people to restore social order after the war. So they had the opportunity to fill this gap, to fill this void for values, which we perceive as radical, of course, in the context of foreign fighter mobilization. But these values are among many other offered values during the war and in the post-war period. So from this perspective, my answer to this question is what is more specific about the Balkan societies and their contribution to the foreign fighter mobilization is that due to this post-war fragility, let's call it this way, radical influencers had the space to become influential, to engage with local communities and to attract or to make appeals to youngsters in a way that was heard. It's not about different recruitment patterns, in my view. It's not about different motivations or different ideological framework, but it's rather about the conducive environment, which was, how to say, facilitated by this post-war fragility. And then I was like, okay, but we have Kosovo. So it's not only about Bosnia, but we also have like Serbia and Montenegro, and they didn't experience the war the same way. Or we cannot talk about these societies as post-conflict societies. We have Albania, Bulgaria in a very, very small scale compared to the other countries. So the way I find explanation in this story is by comparing the conflicts and how actually these radical milieus or post-war radical milieus appeared in the context of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo on the other side. So what I believe matters mostly is the nature of the conflict, meaning that in the Kosovo case, we have more, the cause was about, it was more about nationalism. So even though religion was not the cause of the Bosnian war, religion played more significant role throughout the conflict compared to the Kosovo war. And in this sense, the so-called foreign mujahideen, who were the first actors, foreign actors bringing certain ideological views to the ground, they weren't welcomed to that extent. They weren't accepted in the framework of the Kosovo conflict compared to the Bosnian war. So the nature of the conflict, in my view, certainly matters. The second thing is the appearance of these foreign actors and then their survival, ideological survival in the post-war period in both cases differ enormously. So these factors, I think, might be the possible explanation in which way exactly the conflicts in the region matter to the recruitment of foreign fighters.
Vrlo smo svjesni uloge, dakle, tog postratnog milija, narativa i ideologije koja je na neki način, da tako kažemo, došla sa strane i uhvatila korijene u zemljama Balkana. Ono što me u tom nekako kontekstu isto interesuje jeste zapravo uloga nekih različitih, da kažemo, centara moći u utjecaju i procesu regrutacije, na koji način su ti centri moći učestvovali, da tako kažemo, i doprinosili socijalizaciji u taj radikalni milje i zapravo kako su funkcionirali i kako i danas funkcioniraju. Da li je tu bilo nekih iz vaših istraživanja, da li je došlo do nekih promjena u tome?
So just going back to part of my previous answer, so I was very puzzled by how to explain the fact that, okay, we had like war legacy in some societies or some countries in the region, but not in others, and we still had this phenomenon, and how this is how these networks actually are connected to whole the region. And what I found interesting is that, for instance, the fighters in Montenegro were mostly inspired by, as you call them, and I also use this term, power centers. So they were inspired by influential figures who were either in Bosnia or in Kosovo, people who were active through social media, online content, producing videos, engaging with their followers online, but also attending events organized by one or another NGO or organization throughout the region. So in this sense, I would say that in the Balkans we had two different contingents, more or less the way I see them, tied by linguistic and ethnic connections. One of them is the ethnic Albanian. The other one is the Bosnian, connecting people from Sanjak, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also going to diaspora communities with the strongest power center in Vienna, where we have a couple of people who moved during the war, or they were based in Vienna and they're still based in Vienna. Some of them got sentenced in relation to foreign fighter recruitment. So this network, the way I explain it, is through power centers. And what is a power center? Power center, in my view, it's about influential figure. It can be the way we call them radical imam, or it can be also, in the case of Kosovo, one of the very charismatic and very influential ISIS commanders who got killed in Syria. He didn't have any religious background. He wasn't like ideological figure, but he had this militant image, which was also very influential and made people get inspired. So in this sense, I would say that these power centers are about one or more influencers tied to each other. They're not simply recruiters, they're not simply radical imams, but they're people who cooperate at like ideological and operational level in order to provide the support for those contingents to arrive in Syria between 2012 and 2016. And when I say that we have like two different streams or two different contingents, what I found interesting is that people, influencers from Albania were connected, of course, to those in Kosovo, and those in Kosovo were connected to those in North Macedonia. And if we even take a closer look, we can see that, for instance, maybe due to the proximity, the distance, the geography of the region, even the radical influencers from North Macedonia and Kosovo were more active in social interaction and building some sort of like leadership community compared to their ties to the Albanian leadership network. So there was like this slight detachment, in my view, of the Albanian radical influencers compared to the Kosovo, North Macedonian ones. Just because we know Skopje and Pristina, they're close enough. So there was like exchange of visits. There was like a number of events and activities organized or initiated by local NGOs tied to this group of people. Looking at the Bosnian case, I would say that we have at least 3 power centers, as I said. One of them was in Novi Pazar, active among 2 organizations, like one of them is a mosque and one very influential NGO. And then we have a couple of micro power centers around different leaders in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bilal Bosnić and Nusret Imamović, but they are not the only ones. They are just the most popular names that we are working with. And then we have the extension of this story with the Power Center in Vienna, about a couple of people, again, who were also quite influential throughout the years. And what I find very interesting, and linking this to the war, is that these people didn't become foreign fighters, but they certainly influenced the process of recruitment. And yeah, I'm going to stop here.
Vodi nekako baš ovom pitanju dakle uloge zajednica u dijaspori, balkanskih, da tako kažemo, zajednica koje su nastale, govorimo o zajednicama koje su nastale kao posljedica zapravo ratova u bivšoj Jugoslaviji. Suštinski, upravo kako bi nastavila na ovu priču o Beču i tako dalje, koja je zapravo tu bila uloga, pošto je dijaspora prilično i njena uloga u procesu radikalizacije ostaje na neki način jedan od onih research gaps u cijelom istraživanju i bavljenju pitanjem radikalizacije. Koja je uloga dijasporskih zajednica zaista u tome? I ono, koliko znam, trenutno radiš i na prikupljanju data setova za jedno od istraživanja koje će se baviti ulogom dijaspore u procesima radikalizacije.
Yes, thank you for this, because I'm actually really excited to share some thoughts about this. So, linking the two contingents to the Kosovo and the Bosnian wars, again, what we can see is that, for instance, the refugee flow in the context of the Bosnian war was mostly directed towards Austria, Switzerland as well. Whereas in the Kosovo case, we have extended diaspora groups in, for instance, Belgium or Germany. So we can see that already we have different destinations of this refugee flows after the war. Following the trajectory of these communities, we can see how foreign fighter recruitment was from the region was linked to different countries in Western Europe. And to add Albania to this story, which is a separate story from the Kosovo refugee flows, Albanians from Albania had the chance to develop their immigration history a bit earlier, after the fall of communism. So their links are mostly to Italy. And for instance, foreign fighters from Albania were mostly connected to diaspora members in Italy. The Kosovo and the Macedonian Albanians, they were connected to diaspora, their respective diasporas in Belgium, Germany, Switzerland to a certain extent. Whereas the Bosnian one has been mostly connected to the one in Vienna. Why Vienna? Because Vienna became a very important hub for distribution of humanitarian aid during the Bosnian War. As I said, there were a couple of figures in the Salafi movement who emerged during these years and remained persistently influential after that. And what is interesting is that, in my view, the two post-war radical milieus connected to their respective diaspora communities, because they have different age, the Bosnian war, the Bosnian post-war radical milieu has been better established abroad. It has this power center. It has these influential figures who played a role in the recruitment of foreign fighters in the recent years. Whereas the more recent legacy of the Albanian radical milieu and its extension abroad shows empirically that there was no well-developed, for instance, leadership or some sort of a powerful, influential figures to whom we can refer and say they played a significant role in the recruitment process of foreign fighters. We had links mostly through some sort of family or kinship links, but we don't have this sort of how to say, again, influential figure who played a significant role in this process of mobilization. And in my view, this is due to the age of this younger, very fuzzy or not that well established radical milieu of the Albanian community abroad.
Ja ću imati još nekako dva pitanja, tako da se uklopimo ovaj neki vremenski okvir. Ovo što me sljedeće zanima povezano je sa odgovorima na prethodno pitanje, budući da veze između, da tako kažemo, ovih influencera ili regrutera i sljedbenika, ili oni koji se regrutiraju, suštinski određuje koliko je neki od tih centara moći o kojima si govorila snažan i kakav mobilizacijski efekt ima, što je posljedično dakle da je potrebna snažnija interakcija da bi istovremeno i mobilizacija bila uspješnija. Kako onda u tom kontekstu objašnjavaš taj utjecaj dijaspore? Dakle, interakcija se može odvijati naravno na nivou društvenih mreža i tako dalje, ali ono što su i neka naša istraživanja pokazala jeste da je taj posljednji neki touch u smislu regrutacije, mobilizacije za odlazak na stranu ratište neki lični. Da li onda stvarno dijasporske zajednice igraju stvarnu ulogu centara moći i u regiji, dakle u zemljama regije, ili možda njihova na neki način uloga možda u nekom segmentu čak i prenaglašena, budući da samo da ti pojedinci, neki koji su istaknuti, dolaze iz tih centara.
Yeah, thank you for this question. My attempt when I started researching this topic was to move the conversation from locations, because we usually say, oh, this village is very poor, or people are unemployed, or they did have this and this background, and this is why they decided to participate as foreign fighters in this conflict. To move the conversation from locations to individuals, and to say that first, it's not only about the foreign fighters who went to fight, because we usually look at them individually, but it's mostly about people who remain, but they influenced the process and they were actively engaged with the process, but they had different function. And yes, I agree with you that what we observed previously was mostly done through personal interaction. I like one note here would be, I'm really curious to see what our conversation is going to be 5 years from now after 2020, because I think that this argument has been changing dramatically in the past year and a half, and this idea that the build-up of personal trust and loyalty matters enormously. Maybe it's going to have some sort of like online variation in the future. So I think that there were like two pathways. The first way of engagement was exactly personal engagement. There is very limited data, and part of it is from your reports of Atlantic Initiative about visits, about attendance of local influencers going, for instance, to Vienna, or people from Vienna coming to the region and trying to influence certain communities. But what I find particularly interesting is that, especially now with people returning from Syria or trying to have a conversation about what is the best solution to repatriation of foreign fighters, I think it's important to distinguish between two different processes of radical socialization or radicalization. Because looking at the Balkan contingents, we can see that part of the people were, of course, very committed. They were part of certain ideological circles. They were tied closely to radical influencers. But on the other hand, we have a lot of women a lot of children, a lot of people who ended up in the battlefield without necessarily seeking to become foreign fighters. A label that we use, but it's not necessarily precise enough to describe the complex group of individuals who went to Syria and Iraq. So from this point of view, I distinguish between people who had positive relationship with the radical milieu, for instance, people who lived in Gornja Malča or Oshve, or they were part of very conservative, very isolated religious community. So part of these people, we can say that they had like positive, active relationship with the radical milieu because they would seek some sort of like ideological engagement. However, other members of their families, for instance, they were introduced to the cause through socialization in the family, which means a different pattern of socialization. These people didn't spend long hours watching videos from Syria, or they didn't get indoctrinated because they intended to get more involved in these circles. But through the social dynamics within the family, they ended up belonging to these contingents. And from this point of view, I think it's important because sometimes we may look at these clusters, for instance, 15 people departed from a particular place. But if we look closely, we can see that 10 of these people were women and children who weren't necessarily actively seeking participation in a war. So in this sense, I think it's important to just use this framework to be more precise about the profile of the people who belong to these groups.
Mislim da bi u ovom završnom dijelu bilo važno da se fokusiramo na ovu trenutnu dinamiku, odnosno ono što se već praktično jednom rečenicom spomenula u ovom odgovoru na prethodno pitanje. Imamo iskustvo ovo 1,5-godišnje jednog specifičnog načina života i djelovanja na kraju krajeva za sve nas. Kako se ova COVID dinamika odrazila i na procese radikalizacije i istovremeno druga jedna dinamika koja je paralelna ovoj ISIL inspiriranoj radikalizaciji jeste zapravo jedan snažan rast radikalni desnici, ne samo u Evropi, nego praktično u cijelom svijetu. U kojoj mjeri je onda i na tom polju došlo do jedne vrste onog što mi nazivamo osnaživanja neke možda recipročne te radikalizacije? Da li je taj trend možda sad nekako primijetan?
So yeah, that's very interesting in both cases. But my comment would be that ISIS has failed to like a tactical level. COVID didn't help them much because of the lockdowns. So we didn't have major attacks in the past couple of years for many reasons. But part of them is that COVID affected, for instance, the freedom of movement. They couldn't move so freely. They couldn't cross borders. They couldn't conduct major attacks. Once again, they couldn't cooperate at this personal level that we were talking about. They couldn't like socialize. However, since everything has moved to the online communication, I would expect that ideologically and in more strategic terms, or let's say in long term, the survival of this ideological commitment has become stronger. So tactically, COVID didn't help jihadist groups across Europe, but strategically, I think we are going to see the ideological commitment getting stronger in the next years. And when it comes to the presence of these actors, I think that they are still very visible in social networks, not that much like on Twitter and Facebook as used to be the case. but certainly Telegram and other platforms that they use to communicate and exchange ideas and thoughts. When it comes to the far right, I recently wrote a very short paper on the narratives used in Central Europe, but I think this can be extended to the Balkans and the entire region of Southeastern Europe. And from the previous discussion between Denis and Michael, we heard from them that these narratives were very active. They were used by, I can add maybe that there was a change. In the beginning of the pandemic, there were certain frames or certain narratives that were more active, especially using racist rhetoric or some sort of nationalist rhetoric. And I think that this moved towards more COVID-specific topics like vaccination, for instance, the vaccine policies adopted in different countries. So we have this shift of narratives, and I would say that still, although their online presence has been very strong, when it comes to the mobilization aspect, it's still very early to say to what extent COVID affected these groups. But their presence is more visible than 5 years ago. And although some of you mentioned that in the Balkans, the problem doesn't at first glance, it's not that visible. I think that this invisible processes of socialization, not necessarily radicalization, will lead to more consolidated groups in the future.
Thank you, Asa, and thank you, Professor Saad. We will continue with our third expert talk with Dr. Anton Shekovtsov from Center for Democratic Integrity. He will talk with Professor Edina Bečirović from Atlantic Initiative, and the topic is geopolitics of the far right and Russia.
Greetings to everyone. Our guest today has been researching the relations between Russia and the far-right organizations, movement, and parties in the West since 2014. And that research has resulted in a highly praised book that is now already regarded as classical text on this subject, and it's absolutely unavoidable reference, Russian and the Western far-right Tango Noir. He has also published a number of other very significant essays, studies, and articles on this subject, and I'm honored that Dr. Anton Shekovtsov accepted the invitation of the Atlantic Initiative to participate in this discussion today. Over the past several years, Russia has not only intervened in the Western elections that has been widely publicized, but it has also used increasingly aggressive tactics to exert malign influence in the Western Balkans. For example, they have actively worked to prevent the Euro-Atlantic integration of countries in the region by supporting anti-Western factions in Serbia and elsewhere in the region, and encouraging the secession of the majority Serbian entity Republika Srpska from Bosnia and Herzegovina. This also includes hostile intervention in Macedonia and in Montenegro. The Atlantic Initiative research team has been warning about these negative influences in Russia, of Russia since 2010. But quite often, some of our colleagues from the West and Western decision makers we interviewed during our research told us that we are exaggerating when warning about the Russian threat. It seems that this Western pattern of ignorance of Russian threat goes back to the end of the Cold War. When there was a significant decline of interest in Russia among Western policy decision makers as well as in academia. Anton, can you tell us a few factors that have contributed to this Western ignorance of the Russian threat?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm grateful to the Atlantic Initiative for the invitation, and Adina, thank you for your question. Let me start with saying that in order to answer this question, let's go back briefly to the 90s or to the end of the 1980s. So since 1985, the Soviet Union was undergoing the so-called perestroika, process of somewhat liberalization of the Soviet Union. Then in 1989, there was this collapse of the socialist bloc. The Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire fell in 1991. And essentially, Russia, under President Boris Yeltsin, it tried to approach the West. It tried to export back to Russia some of the Western values, at least officially. And also there was a process of marketization of Russia becoming a market economy. And also from the Western part, we saw that the idea of the end of history was essentially dominating all the discussions about non-Western world. That was also, the 90s was also, especially the first half of the 90s, was the period of the celebration of globalization. Very few people at that time saw that there is a downside to the globalization. There is a dark side of globalization. But for a very long time, globalization was celebrated. And the idea of the end of history was that Russia, although it probably is still not a Western market democracy yet, but it was going there. So most of the, I would say most of the attention was largely on the Western part, was largely paid to the economic side of transformations in Russia and countries of the post-Soviet republics, post-Soviet countries, and also former socialist countries. That was the major focus. So, and you may remember quite clearly that even in the Yugoslav war, Russia was basically absent. There were foreign fighters, as we would say today, coming from Russia, joining the various sides of the conflict, but mostly on the part of Serbia, or Greater Serbia at that time, or Yugoslavia, what was left of it. But still, Russia as such only reappeared in the Balkans, I would say only with the developments around Kosovo, when Russia really invested some of the energy and its power in trying to somehow solve the conflict. So on the part of the West, the major factors, to sum it up what I said, the major factor was this obsession with the idea of the end of history, that everything will now become more or less liberal and we don't need to pay attention to Russia anymore. Also, parts of this ignorance was, I think, driven by, well, Western arrogance. That, okay, so Russia lost in the Cold War, and it was the case that it did lose the Cold War. So, and much of the expertise on Russia disappeared. And also another factor is that Russia was not really trying to undermine the West at that time. So the threat coming from Russia was, I would say, minuscule. It was almost non-existent up until, well, I would say relatively recently. So I think these are major factors that contributed to this lack of knowledge about Russia, the consequences of which we still see today.
But even today, when there is a more or less consensus and it's so obvious, and we hear a lot in academic and policy circles about the malign influence of Russia hurting liberal democracies, interfering in Western elections, supporting far-right parties and far-right groups. Not all Western liberal democracies and their leaderships share the same opinion about that threat. It seems that there is a lack of united front against Russia. Can you tell us why is that so, and what are the consequences of this lack of kind of united opinion and united strategy? Yes, we hear a lot about the malign influence, but on the other hand, you know, there is a difference between German relations with Russia and Italian and especially some other Western liberal democracies, if they can even be called liberal democracies any longer, like, you know, some EU members like Hungary and so on.
Well, I see the difference here, and I think this difference is underpinned by the fact that malign influence of Putin's Russia is uneven in the West. So in some countries we can see more malign influence, and in some countries we see less malign influence. And this also has to do, a lot of this has to do with the importance that a particular society, a particular country has in the eyes of the Russian establishment. So, for example, it is much more important for Putin's regime to exert influence in Germany, France, for example, compared to countries such as Portugal or Denmark or Belgium. Because the significance, and I think it's not only, you know, in the Russian eyes, it's also in the eyes of the you know, the economic might of those countries that is important for Putin's regime. In some countries, Russia basically lacks agents of influence, and this is also very important. Because if you want to exert some malign influence, you always need to have those people who would amplify your narratives, who will amplify your you know, propaganda. And when you don't have those people, well, you're lost then. Your malign influence will hardly work. You can always rely, obviously, on cyber attacks or on cyber warfare. You don't really need, for this, you don't really need, you know, allies in that particular country, or, you know, agents of influence. You just need some hackers working for GRU, or, you know, some freelance hackers who would cooperate with the FSB. But I remember, I really like this tweet. It was, I think, in 2018 that a Russian embassy based in Denmark tweeted that many people accuse Russia of interfering in future Danish elections. And then they say, you see, all the parties in Denmark are Russophobic. So we can't really interfere. I mean, they're all Russophobic. So, and I think this is partly true. If you don't have allies, if you don't have agents, you know, or people who would be friendly politicians in a particular society, you will not really have much malign influence. So the answer to your question is that why some countries are not so concerned about Russian malign influence is because some of them don't really experience it. And this is very important, because if you don't experience something, it's quite difficult for you to believe that this exists. And especially if we're talking about politics, politicians are usually concerned about domestic politics, what's happening inside their countries. And this is also what's more interesting for the electorate, what's happening right here in our country, rather than, you know, international affairs or foreign policy. This, of course, this lack of understanding on the part of some countries, it leads to the erosion of solidarity when the solidarity is needed. Especially, I mean, in the context of today, I think the most important development today, I mean, where the solidarity is needed, is the sanctions imposed on Russia for particular violations. domestically or internationally, you know, the bad international behavior. This is where the solidarity is lacking sometimes. But you're also quite correct saying that in some countries, such as Hungary, there's Russian malign influence. Well, it's not really needed. It is there, but for example, they wouldn't even bother creating a Hungarian version of the Sputnik News, or not even to say about the Hungarian version of RT, because Orban propaganda machine is working much more efficiently than any Russian propaganda resource would have been working. So you don't really need to have this Russian influence there, because Hungary or Orban's regime is eroding democracy and liberalism on its own.
Okay, well, it's troubling for Bosnia and Herzegovina, you know, this lack of kind of united front of Western liberal democracy recognizing malign influence in Russia, taking the role of international community in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It would be really important that they all do recognize malign Russian influence in Western Balkans and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Recently, we had the leading European diplomat in Bosnia and Herzegovina saying that he doesn't really recognize malign Russian influence in Bosnia and Herzegovina. But in one of your recent publications or presentations, you stated that Russia's main targets are really the US and the EU, and that they're not that much interested in Eastern Europe. I mean, for some of the reasons you mentioned now, but also because liberal democracy is underdeveloped there. And one of the main goals of Russia is hurting major liberal democracies. But at the same time, you did mention that Russia is very much interested in Western Balkan countries, and that they invest major resources in hindering NATO integration of these countries. Mm-hmm. Can we just maybe draw some of these parallels?
Yes, I truly believe that the US is the major target, the main target of Russia. And it all, you know, goes back to the Cold War, where you would have the US and the Soviet Union competing with each other for, well, domination in particular areas of the world, or even for global domination. So this condition, I think, it's sorely missed in today's Russia. They really want to have the same competition. They really want to be accepted and accepted by the US as their main competitor. So when the US says that it is China that is the main competitor of the US and the West in general, Russia, of course, is very, very sad about this fact. They want to be one of those poles that form the multipolar world. And with the obsession, because Putin's Russia is particularly obsessed about the idea that the unipolar world is now over. So the US American domination is now gone. And then the multipolar world arises from the ashes of this presumed fall of the unipolar world. But at the same time, they also understand that it is very, very difficult to be one of those poles in this multipolar world. So the US is the main target. It's also the only, I would say, probably the only country that Russia wants to have a dialogue with. Even the European Union is considered by Putin's regime as very weak, pretty corrupt. But you can actually corrupt those politicians of the West, especially Western parts of the European Union. And they also see, well, look, you know, France and Germany, these are shopping areas for the oligarchs and the Russian elites. It's not, those are not real countries, and the narrative would be that, well, they are so weak, they would sell us anything, and when they are a bit strong, it's actually because the Washington is trying to exert influence on them. It's only because of Washington they are behaving in such a bad way, imposing sanctions on us, etc., etc. Spain, Italy, these are beaches for Putin's regime. These are not real countries. This is what's going on in their heads. Balkans is a bit different. Balkans as a sort of, of course, Yugoslavia was non-aligned socialist country during the Cold War, but Balkans have, I would say, psychohistorical significance for Putin's Russia. Balkans are very important psychologically in this sense because they were part of, as some would believe, the in the sphere of influence of the Soviet Union, and they have to remain as such. Although some countries obviously moved to the West, they became part of the EU, part of NATO, but at the same time there is still this gray area. So these, psychohistorical reasons that we still need to keep Balkans in our sphere of influence. Then there are these old geopolitical ideas about Balkans and in Eastern Europe in general, because sometimes Balkans are considered not to be Southern Europe, but Eastern Europe, is that, and this is from the British geopolitician Mackinder, who said that he who controls or commands Eastern Europe commands the heartland. Who commands the heartland commands the world island, and who controls the world island controls the entire world. So the Balkans have also this sort of old geopolitical significance for Russia, and of course it's very important. I think it's with like with Ukraine. If you allow societies such as Serbian, such as Bosnian, such as Ukrainian to succeed in democratization, in rapprochement with the West, then it actually gives a very bad example to the Russian society. So they would think, look, our Serbian brothers or our Ukrainian brothers, those little Russians, as some would refer to Ukrainians, well, they succeeded. They became part of the West, or at least they became part of, very important political unions such as the European Union and NATO. Why can't we? And when the Russians en masse start asking this question, that would be the end of Putin's regime. Because, well, if they can, why can't we? So, and Putin, obviously, and the entire Putinist system, it needs to prevent other societies which are historically and culturally close to the Russians. They need to prevent them from succeeding, so they would not give a bad example to the Russians themselves.
Okay, well, thank you, Anton. I mean, I'm not really very proud to be Western Balkan centered or Bosnia centered, but this is a rare opportunity that we have in the Atlantic Initiative to talk to you. So, I would like to hear, and we would like to hear a little bit more about Russian policy towards Western Balkans. And there is one more alliance that is really important for Bosnia and Herzegovina and Western Balkans. That is relations between Russia and Turkey, because that is a very interesting dynamics. We've seen that when Russia and Turkey get closer together, Turkey, at least on a rhetorical level, withdraws support this unconditional support for the integration of BiH into NATO. That also, of course, depends on the Turkey relations with other NATO members, particularly with the US. So when those relations cool with Russia, Turkey once again becomes vocal in support for that integration. So since this Putin-Erdogan relation is so relevant for the Western Balkan region and Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, may I ask you to elaborate a bit on that as well?
Well, you see, I think relations between Turkey and Russia are very, very complicated. And they all depend on, well, much of them, I think, depend on Erdogan rather than Putin. Because Erdogan, he's a, well, at least probably he considers himself as the leader of a country that is on the rise. He probably, well, obviously he doesn't have any global role. He doesn't probably see Turkey as playing a global role in the world, but Turkey is now emerging both in Erdogan's imagination and I think also in the real world as a very strong regional power. If you observe the conflict around Nagorno-Karabakh last year, conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, you will see that Turkey, quite unexpectedly, played a very important role in helping Azerbaijan, well, secure victory over Armenia and, well, grab some of the territories of Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a disputed territory, but internationally considered to be part of Azerbaijan. And this intrusion, I would say, of Turkey into the post-Soviet space, I think it does bother Putin. So I wouldn't say that these relations, well, I said already that these relations between the two leaders and between two countries, they're really complicated. I think now, and they are going, you know, on and off. Either they're enemies or they're friends, and this changes quite often. And this is because Erdogan has his own agenda. Sometimes it changes, and Erdogan is trying to play on different fronts. He plays with the European Union, he plays with Russia, he plays with Israel, he plays with other actors in the region. And in order to, you know, to have some balance, then you basically strain relations between some of your allies even. Now we see that Russia is escalating the situation because recently Turkish Erdogan talked to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and again said that Turkey was supporting Ukraine's territorial integrity, that they would not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea. So that really bothered Putin, and now I think 500,000 Russian tourists cannot go to Turkey because Turkey is now announced as, you know, red zone. You can't go there. Then we have some sort of strained relations with the US around Biden's decision to recognize the Armenian genocide by Ottoman Turkey. So Erdogan will need to, you know, navigate through very, very stormy waters in order to establish himself as the leader, as the regional leader. This is why Balkans will always, at least from the point of view of Turkey, it will always be like a playground for Turkey, depending on what alliance he's thinking, or Erdogan is thinking of at this very precise moment. It may change tomorrow. This is Erdogan, you know, being very, very spontaneous.
Yes, we are really very much aware, and we, you know, in Bosnia and Herzegovina in particular, we do feel this lack of consistency, or he's spontaneous, as you put it kindly. But I mean, let me go back to the research from your book, though you did mention it at the beginning, but you present impressive research about Russian support for the far right in the West. Can you maybe tell us some key features of those links between the far right in the West and Russia? How does this cooperation takes place?
Let me start with a metaphor. The subtitle of the book is Tango Noir, and there is this phrase that it takes two to tango. So this tango noir, or black tango, is between Putin's Russia and the Western far right. But I like to extend this metaphor of saying that there is a third player in these relations, in this dance. It is the mainstream West. So when Russia cannot secure good relations with the West, when it fails to corrupt Western politicians, then it starts dancing with the far right. So imagine a ballroom where you would have this really beautiful lady, which is the mainstream West, standing somewhere, and Russia, Putin asking her to dance a tango with him. And well, the mainstream says, well, no. And then Putin's regime tries to invite another beautiful lady, in spite, just to make probably the first lady, quite nervous about this. So what am I saying is that the plan A for Putin's regime is to work with the mainstream West, is to work with people who are in power, and usually, with the exception of Hungary, probably, it's liberal Democrats who are in charge of Western democracies. So for Russia, the main aim, as I said, would be to work with the mainstream, either by corruption or by promoting some mutual economic interests, because essentially they don't consider the EU as real countries. They are either puppets of Washington, or they're just a misguided, confused society that do not understand why it is so beneficial to work with Russia, and especially now why they don't understand why it would be very important to go back to business as usual and lift all the sanctions, etc., etc. So this is plan A. The plan B, if it doesn't work, well, then we are, if a good cop idea does not work for us, then we will be a bad cop. And being a bad cop, well, let's support the forces that are undermining the West or undermining the European Union on their own. Let's amplify their messages. Let's support them politically or in media terms. So let's do something bad. If they don't see that it's good for them to cooperate with us, well, let's then destabilize them. So this is, I think, the main reason why Putin's Russia and different actors inside Putin's regime are trying to cooperate with the far right. It doesn't happen all the time, but it happens in those times where they feel that the links with the mainstream do not work. One, I think, very good example is 2017. No, 2016, when there were public opinion polls saying that in France, in the presidential elections the following year, there would be two people in the runoff, in the second run of the presidential elections, François Fillon and Marine Le Pen. And although Marine Le Pen was asking for support from Russia, she did not get it because Russia at that time was quite fine with François Fillon winning French presidency. The mainstream, he had more chances to win. And only when François Fillon's popularity went down and Emmanuel Macron's popularity went up, only then Moscow decided to support Marine Le Pen. So
do you think
it's
that
also very pragmatic in some cases?
Do you think that Marine Le Pen will receive Russia's support in the next elections?
Well, that will depend very much on Macron and how popular he will be, how popular Le Pen will be. So they're monitoring the situation all the time. Macron, he's also a very complicated partner for Moscow, because sometimes he's talking about, well, he's employing this realpolitik language, saying, well, we need to have a dialogue with Russia, etc., etc. And at the same time, France was at the forefront, at the front of introducing sanctions related to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny last year. So Macron is a complicated figure, and I think they're still trying to understand, to figure out what to do with Macron, whether to interfere or not to interfere in the presidential elections in France next year.
Okay, well, now I'd like us to turn a little bit to the question of ideology. It's interesting that the media, but also the academia in the Western Balkans, doesn't really pay too much attention to the ideology of neo-Euro-Asianism. I mean, in your writings, you do analyze the work of Alexander Dugin, and you do explore ideology. You don't shy away to calling it a fascist ideology, which is centered on the idea of revolutionizing the Russian society and building a totalitarian Russia-dominated Eurasian empire. How much Dugin's ideology does actually reflect on Russian domestic and foreign policy of Russia? How much Dugin has influence on Putin? I mean, we received some controversial reports about Dugin's influence on Putin.
I must say that I belong to a category of people who would say that Dugin has almost zero influence on Putin. Dugin has his own political agenda. He is ideological. He is an ideological figure. He's an ideologue of neo-Eurasianism, which is, you're quite correct, I define as a form of fascism. But I don't believe that Putin's regime is ideological. I do believe that it has some ideas, but they do not really form an ideology. And pragmatism or cynicism is much more important, is a much more important tool of Putin's Russia than ideology. Being a cynical regime, it does employ sometimes people or engage with people, both internationally and domestically, who have ideologies and who they would believe could be useful for Moscow to promote some of the Russian foreign policy interests. So, and let me give you an example about Dugin. Yes, I did write about him a lot, but I believe that my interest in him was purely scientific, in the sense that I was trying to employ the theoretical framework of Professor Roger Griffin, who is the main author and I would say in the studies of fascism, both historically and in contemporary times, trying to analyze, employ his framework in order to assess different ideologies. So, but I wasn't really writing that Dugin was an important thinker, or at least a person who would influence the authorities. However, Dugin is quite influential in the in Russian academia. There he is indeed quite influential. He is influential in some military circles in Russia, but it does not really translate into the influence over Putin. One of the examples, in 2014, when, well, Dugin was not really, well, he was, you know, doing something, he was not really important, he would not appear in the media. And then in 2014, with the annexation of Crimea and the start of the Russian-Ukrainian war, Putin's regime needed some radical voices. And suddenly, Dugin started to appear in the mainstream, well, mainstream Russian media. And he was talking all those really, you know, right-wing extremist or simply extremist idea of dismembering Ukraine, of waging a total war against Ukraine. So why was he needed? Well, it was just for some comparison, for some so people would see, well, look, okay, so Putin is probably waging a war against Ukraine, but look, there's this lunatic who is so crazy. And then you think, well, probably Putin maybe, well, he's not that crazy, right? So he's normal, you know, compared to, or in contrast to people such as Dugin. And so he was important in this way. Then you have you know, various people who are competing for the resources that the Kremlin manages, and there is this businessman, Konstantin Malofeev, for example, who was actually quite interested in the Balkan affairs, and especially with Republika Srpska. And Dugin was working for him, and he still works for Konstantin Malofeev because Dugin has all these very important contacts in Europe, across Europe, including Western Balkans. So Dugin, he's a good networker. So there is a number of aspects that are quite useful for the Kremlin that Dugin can provide.
Yeah, may I just say, I mean, it seems because we need to kind of go towards wrapping up, but it seems to me that, yeah, it doesn't really have a direct influence on Putin, but within the concept of so-called active measures that, you know, you talk about, Dugin and his ideology do
He's
have...
an instrument. He's an instrument, you know, he's not a mastermind, he's an instrument.
An instrument, and it's useful for us to be familiar with his ideology and how it's being used with Russia. I mean, there are so many other questions that I would like to ask you, but we unfortunately have just 3 more minutes, and I would, but then we can maybe address some of these questions during the discussion. But maybe to wrap up this interview, it would be good to hear what is your advice for researchers, journalists, and academics, but also policymakers in Bosnia and Herzegovina regarding Russian influence. What is the best and the most effective way to oppose it? Or we just need to rely on international community decision makers in Bosnia and Herzegovina? Do we have the way to oppose it?
I think the best answer here would be that Russian malign influence is successful in those cases where it can identify weaknesses in the target societies and exploit them. The less weaknesses you have, the less chance, or the worst chance Russia would have to exert this malign influence in your society. So I think the best way is just to identify your own weaknesses and try to heal the wounds. Because Russia is essentially, Putin's Russia, I'm not saying anything about the Russian people, I'm saying about the regime. Putin's Russia is like a bad doctor It can identify your weaknesses and wounds and, you know, make them hurt. The good doctor will try to cure them, to heal the wounds. But as a bad doctor, Putin's regime, you know, it's trying to make things worse. But then you need to identify those weaknesses on their own and deal with them, address the real existing problems. Because sometimes what Russia is doing, it takes a problem and makes it worse. But the problem does exist without Russia.
Anton, thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, this is really very interesting. I would have really liked for this interview to last a bit longer so that we can address more questions. But yeah, I'll stop here and then I'll turn it over to Nermina.
Thank you so much, Irina and Anton. It was really a pleasure to hear you. Before I continue, I'll just say that there is our box Q&As, and for all questions, please write them there. I will keep up with questions that are already in the box. So the first one, as I saw, was for Michael. Yeah. So Michael, the question for you is, how are the far-right groups you have investigated in Central and Eastern Europe connected to religious organizations?
That's a really interesting question, because I think when people are who aren't unfortunately, you know, versed or immersed in this far-right universe, they might think that a lot of these far-right groups, or all of these far-right groups, have links with religious groups. And what's quite interesting is that a lot of them do not. Part of that is down to the fact that a lot of these far-right groups that are outright neo-Nazi and whatnot, they're simply, in their own beliefs, they are, broadly put, or they're pagan and they're anti-Christian, essentially. So they have no time for an organized religion, an Orthodox or Catholic church in a particular country. You see that in Ukraine, for example, where the Azov movement is hardly some sort of movement that could be talked about as being linked to Christianity or religious groups in any way. Here in Serbia, there are, of course, some far-right groups who use sort of Orthodox imagery, some of those traditional Serbian Orthodox images. In Croatia, of course, there are some, but I would say that of the most, I guess, extreme far-right groups and individuals, that they are generally not overtly linked with religious groups. I think those groups on, to use a terminology more broadly, on the radical right, who may be like organized political parties, they may well have some links to religious groups and evoke more traditionalism related to religion and what they talk about. But in terms of the group schools that I've covered, I tend not to see them as being overtly linked to religious groups or using Christian, quote unquote, Christian imagery in any context other than sort of generic anti-Muslim, anti-refugee propaganda. It's not out of any religious conviction on their part.
Thank you so much for that answer. I will continue with one more question for you. From your empirical research, how would you explain the role of historical memory and revisionism on radicalization in Yugosphere and more broader Eastern Europe? You mentioned myths. Could you elaborate more? Mm-hmm. And did you find any specific tactics for recruitment of youth, online or otherwise, in that regard?
That's in terms of historical revisionism and debates about historical memory. I think that's something that we see across Central and Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe, and of course, certainly not just in this part of the world, despite what those of us from quote unquote Western countries may want to think. We also have our own debates and issues and unresolved issues with historical memory and even historical revisionism. But with what I've seen in the variety of the countries that I'm familiar with, that I've researched, that I've done work in, I think whilst there isn't always necessarily an overt reference all the time to historical revisionism or debates about historical memory, it's always an underlying common theme that very clearly comes out in the discourse of these far right groups and individuals. You see this in Hungary, for example. Of course, this also comes from the now mainstream in Hungary under Viktor Orban. You see groups like Legio Hungaria with, commemorating a march of pro-Nazi forces, and in talking about the Trianon Treaty that reduced Hungary in size in after the First World War. You get that historical revisionism in the context of Croatia when talking about the NDH. You get that, of course, in Serbia, with not just talking about World War II, but talking about more recent events in Bosnia in the 1990s. I think revisionism in that context in Serbia is another few seminars put together into itself. And you see that in even places like Bulgaria, where the collaboration with the Nazis at the time is sort of glossed over, and the myth about the country, quote unquote, saving its Jews, which is partly true but partly not true, has been elevated to, a real mainstream myth. If there's a common theme across a lot of these countries, I see it as an underlying historical revisionism, an underlying issue that's still being grappled with in terms of historical memory, because a lot of these countries in Central and Eastern Europe, their first real dose of independence came after the fall of communism, and the only other sort of independent states they had before that were, unfortunately, states that were allied with the Nazis, puppet states of the Nazis, or collaborated in varying ways with the Nazis. So in these countries, there's still this grappling with this issue of how do we build or rebuild a nation and a state without, how do we rebuild ourselves? How do we build or rebuild a national identity in a way that doesn't gloss over the nastier parts of our past? I think that's an underlying theme that is common across the region, period. But one side of that revisionism, of course, the taking the side of outright Nazi collaborators, is something that underpins a lot of the far right's rhetoric across the region, even if it isn't always front and center in their messaging. It's not hard to kind of scratch under the surface and see that all these far right groups, like the far right groups in Hungary, have a positive opinion of the Arrow Cross regime, for example, in Bulgaria with General Lukov and the march that they have there. So I hope that answers it.
Thank you so much. Imamo jedno pitanje na bosanskom, pa ću ga kao tako pročitati. Pa da li država Bosna i Hercegovina ima snage da kroz zakonska rješenja zabrani djelovanje četničkim pokretima koji su legalno registrirani u entitetu Republika Srpska i koji se redovno okupljaju uz prateću ikonografiju i pjesme u kojima se prijeti klanjem i progonima? Šta vam govori to što je ravnogarski pokret koji baštini fašizam rehabilitovan u Srbiji i izjednačen sa antifašističkim partizanskim pokretom? Šta vam to govori o stanju svijesti zapravo u srbijanskom društvu? A prije nego što ga delegiram bilo kome, možda da mi profesor Saad, ako može, pomogne sa ovim. Mislim da bi možda bilo zgodno ako biste vi mogli.
Samo još jednom, izvinite se onda.
Imali smo pitanje koje se tiče ravnogorskog četničkog pokreta. Dakle, jedan od...
Sad pitanje, Amir Grbović.
Molim?
Čitam ja sad pitanje. Da li država Bosne i Hercegovine ima zakonska rješenja? Dakle, ovdje se suštinski ne radi o bilo kakvoj vrsti snage, nego radi se zapravo o vrlo jasnoj obstrukciji bilo kakvog pokušaja da se kreira zakonsko rješenje kojim se zabranili svi, dakle, da tako kažemo, profašistički ili bilo kakve organizacije koji njeguju neke da tako kažemo, demokratske vrijednosti, odnosno nešto pod navodnicima vrijednosti, nešto što je suprotstavljeno općim vrijednostima i ljudskim pravima koji su definirani Ustavom. Bilo je mnoštvo nekih inicijativa koje nisu uspjele. Kolega Hikmet Kačić, ja smo nedavno isto pravili jedan, tako pod navodnicima se zove bijeli papir, koji je vezan upravo za uspon desnice, negiranje genocida i historijski revizionizam, i pokušat ćemo isto tako s jednom grupom pravnika da zajednički uz neku potporu nekog civilnog, tako reći, društva i nekih međunarodnih organizacija isto predložimo neki način kako zapravo tretirati pokrete koji su slični četnički, ravnogorski pokreti, slične pokrete, njihovu retoriku, činjenicu da se služi i negiranjem genocida i historijskim revizionizmom koji opet u fokus stavlja neki, da tako kažemo, fašistički ili profašistički vrijednosni sistem. I ono što naravno što je ovaj kolega koji pita prepoznao jeste da i neki, tako reći, geografski kontekst i okruženje ne ide Bosni i Hercegovini na ruku u smislu realizacije ovoga rješenja, budući da je upravo, kako i naglasio, Srbija zapravo rehabilitirala taj pokret i rehabilitirala zapravo njegovog vođu, i onda imamo tu jednu obstrukciju, dakle, političkih struktura iz entiteta Republika Srpska koji sjedi u oba doma parlamenta Bosne i Hercegovine, da se takvo zakonsko rješenje koje je bilo neko civilizacijsko dostignuće donese i da uključuje ne samo, dakle, tu zabranu, već jedan poseban zakon koji bi tretirao pitanje negiranja genocida i holokausta, jer imamo, pored negiranja genocida, imamo i povremeno iz takvih tih desničarskih krugova i ovu antisemitski diskurs i taj koji je isto tako potrebno adresirati. Mislim, teško je zaista odgovoriti, jer reći jednostavno da li država ima snage ili nema, dakle, u ovom trenutku niti ima volje, niti ima kapacitete i snage da tu tako nešto uradi. I mislim, mi smo već godinama očekivali da će u nekom momentu se i UHR kao takav probuditi, pokušati bar tu vrstu zakona nametnuti, odnosno nije pokušati, nego to uraditi, a onda kada nametni, već se ima okvir za na neki način krivično, eventualno gonjenje ljudi koji su dio takve organizacije i promoviraju takvu retoriku.
Hvala vam puno, profesorica Edina bi nešto dodala.
Samo kratko bih ja htjela da dodam, potaknuta razgovorom sa Antonom. Čini se da su ti četnički, ravnogorski, ustaški pokreti i svi ti ekstremno desni, nacionalističke, ekstremno desne grupe, da su zapravo vrlo pogodne za mainstream nacionalizme i mainstream nacionalističke partije. Zbog toga što mogu da pokažu na njih i da oni još uvijek povremeno se predstavljaju kao umjereni nacionalisti, što naravno nisu, jer se taj naš mainstream nacionalistička scena davno izuzetno mnogo radikalizirala i od ovih ekstremno desnih grupa se u najvećoj mjeri razlikuje najviše po ikonografiji. Tako da ukinuši ove ekstremno desne, ukinuši četnički ravnogorski pokret i ustašku ikonografiju i tako dalje, tek bi onda zapravo pred međunarodnom zajednicom bilo u punom smislu bačeno svjetlo na to koliko je radikaliziran taj mainstream nacionalistički narativ u Bosni i Hercegovini. To je ta neka igra koju naši vodeći nacionalisti igraju kao ona koju igra Putin sa Duginom, čini mi se.
Hvala puno na odgovorima. Next question is for Professor Anton. It's how important do you think far-right social movements are in Russia and transnationally for Putin to stay in power?
Sorry. I don't think that they are important. They are not, they're instruments of one of those instruments that Putin's regime uses in order to exert its malign influence on the West and on Europe in general. But domestically, at the moment at least, it does not, Putin's regime does not rely on nationalist groups in order to stay in power. It does rely on some nationalist groups to subvert the opposition in order to sometimes disperse protests or to attack particular opposition leaders, but it doesn't really need nationalists to do this. They can also do this with the help of the police. And also the far right is only one instrument in the range of many other instruments to influence European or Western politics. So I wouldn't say that the far right are somehow essential for Putin to stay in power.
Thank you, Anton. I will continue with a question for Asya. Our research to some extent overlaps. I'm very interested to hear more about sources of radicalization of post-war generations that are related to the war in Yugoslavia. How exactly do families radicalize youth? How do peers radicalize youth in regard to the war?
Could you just repeat once again, because there was like an interruption in the beginning?
Yeah, I'm very interested to hear more about sources of radicalization of post-war generations that are related to the war in Yugoslavia. How exactly do families radicalize youth? How do peers radicalize youth in regard to the war?
To be honest, when I started researching this topic, I expected that there would be narratives employed by, I don't know, local radical influencers or people who participated in the war and who are part of the jihadi Salafi circles who would use these frames, references to the war legacy of the region, whether this is the Bosnian War or the Kosovo War. But surprisingly, this is, at least from what I've read and what I could access, this is not the case. The frames that have been used are strictly related to more ultra-conservative religious framework, which is about the one of the Islamic State and all these groups. And the references, like there are a couple of cases in which there are references to the past, mostly to the genocide in Srebrenica, like saying if you don't do this or that, or if you don't belong to the Islamic State, for instance, this might appear again, this might happen. There was like 1 or 2 cases in Kosovo where the cause of nationalism, which was the main of the Kosovo War, was kind of shifted to more religious aspects of the conflict, and used by some of the local radical influencers in order to create narratives, recruitment narratives. But again, these are rather rare episodes compared to the overall propaganda that has been produced. It's not like a leading frame that appeared throughout the regime. And just one thing about families. I don't know whether the question is more, I don't, when I said that they're like family patterns, it's rather the idea that, for instance, the father figure or the brother had the power to influence, let's say, children or wives to follow the decision-making process in the family. And in many cases, for instance, it was the fatherly figure who took the decision of going to Syria, and then the family followed. Of course, this is not always the case, because we also have examples of women or teenagers being active in the process of engagement. But when it comes to the family hijra, the so-called movement of entire families, it was rather this pattern.
Hvala puno. Još mi je preostalo jedno pitanje za Antona. Čini mi se zbog čega Evropska unija u većem obimu ne iskoristi svoje mehanizme da puteve ruskog utjecaja koristi kao svoj korektivni faktor kako bi minimalizirala utjecaj Moskve na radikalne grupe ili političke pojedince. Ovako ispada da je Moskva uvijek korak ispred.
A question for me, yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Well, there is a number of initiatives that the European Union has come up with in recent years to oppose Russian malign influence. Well, first, there is an institution within the framework of the European External Action. There is an agency that tries to identify propaganda, Russian propaganda and disinformation. For what it's worth, I mean, sometimes they are quite useful. Sometimes probably they are exaggerating the threat. Also in the European Parliament now there is a committee that is specifically looking at foreign interference and disinformation. And I presume that one of the main countries of their interest is Putin's Russia. Then, of course, there are national organizations, national agencies, starting with NGOs and ranging up, and also including security services that are dealing with this problem. So I don't think that Russia is always one step ahead. Of course, I mean, Russia is waging, in my opinion, political war against the West and against the European Union, but the European Union is on the defense, and it's not, at the moment, I don't see any consensus or even widespread ideas that the European Union should be on the offense. So European societies, European nations, they establish various agencies, committees that try to oppose this malign influence. But I think it is quite natural that the aggressor will always be, somehow leading the war rather than the party that is on defense.
Hvala puno. Kao što sam, ovo su bila sva pitanja koja smo do sada imali, ako se neko pojavi u međuvremenu, ja ću svakako pročitati. Kao što sam na početku rekla, svaka od ovih tema o kojima smo danas razgovarali tiče se direktno Bosne i Hercegovine i tokom prethodnih 2 sata upravo smo o nekim se dijelovima toga dotakli. Ja bih kratko zaključila, pa svakako na kraju i zahvalila svim učesnicima. Dakle, kada govorimo o utjecajima, sigurnosnim aspektima povratnika iz Sirije i Iraka, potom utjecaju Rusije na globalnu desnicu, ali i krajnje desničarskih organizacijama, negdje se nemoguće dotaći Bosne i Hercegovine i njene uloge tu. Zapravo u prethodnom periodu mogli smo vidjeti da Bosna i Hercegovina zbog svoje složenosti i dinamike u kojoj vlada zapravo je idealno okruženje za ispitivanje odnosa između različitih oblika ekstremizama i njihovih utjecaja. U prvom panelu mogli smo čuti razgovor u kome smo govorili o ukrajinskom bataljonu Azov. Ja sam radila jedno istraživanje prošle godine gdje sam pronašla grupu zapravo u Mostaru koja se veže upravo za simboliku ovog bataljona i ističe zapravo svoje oduševljenje radom ove grupe. Grupa je nastala unutar jedne navijačke skupine i zapravo kao simbol koristi upravo glavno obilježje Azova, Volksangel, koji je zapravo na neki način desno obilježje kukastog križa, odnosno predstavlja istu simboliku. Kada govorimo dalje o specifičnostima Bosne i Hercegovine i desničarskim organizacijama, ono što je specifično je upravo manjak saznanja i djelovanja koji se odnosi na desničarske organizacije. Kada pričamo o zabrani djelovanja različitih organizacija u Bosni i Hercegovini, nemamo takav slučaj. U razgovoru Michaela i Denisa mogli smo čuti zapravo kako govore o Robertu Rundu, koji je prije par mjeseci ušao slobodno na teritoriju Bosne i Hercegovine. Organizacija u kojoj on djelovao tek nedavno je trebala biti stavljena na listu terorističkih, međutim ni to nije učinjeno, tako da sada imamo jednog člana takve organizacije koji se zapravo slobodno šeta teritorijom Bosne i Hercegovine bez da znamo još uvijek gdje je. Iz nekih ranijih istraživanja Atlantske inicijative, kada govorimo o tome na šta se fokusiraju sigurnosne agencije i stručnjaci, mogli smo vidjeti da su oni zapravo i dalje najviše fokusirani na takozvani islamistički terorizam, sa posebnim osvrtom dakle, na sirijske borce, odnosno sada kad sa ovim protekom vremena sada već govorimo o povratnicima sa stranih ratišta. Govorili smo o tome koliko je zapravo državljana Bosne i Hercegovine otišlo. Asija se dotakla toga da to nisu bili samo muškarci. Ista situacija je zapravo bila i u Bosni i Hercegovini. Veliki broj muškaraca i žena i njihove djece otišli su u Siriju. Najveći broj otišao je upravo 2013. godine. Tokom zadnjih par godina takvih odlazaka više nije bilo, međutim neke procjene su da i danas na teritoriji Sirije i Iraka boravi više desetina žena i muškaraca, a poznati podatak da je na tom ratištu život izgubio 101 BiH državljanin, od toga čak 11 žena. Međutim, pored odlaska u Siriju i Irak, ono što je specifično isto tako za Bosnu i Hercegovinu su odlasci osoba koji su išli u Ukrajinu. Dakle, iz Bosne i Hercegovine, odnosno BiH državljana je bilo 11 koji su otišli tamo. O ovim problemima mogli smo čuti zapravo u ovom drugom panelu i ono što je negdje Asija pomenula, što bih ja svakako istaknula kada se dotaknemo Bosne i Hercegovine i zbog toga zašto za islamsku državu bili bitni strani borci zapravo sa Balkana, to je upravo zbog njihove povezanosti sa zapadnom Evropom, zbog toga što dolaze iz društva koje je na neki način vezano za islam, a sam Balkan označen skorašnjim ratom sa neriješenim političkim i etničkim problemima. Kada govorimo dakle o bosanskim borcima, mogli smo čuti iz Asinog izlaganja da to nisu bili samo državljani, ljudi koji trenutno žive u Bosni i Hercegovini, već i u zemljama regiona, a ranije su bili povezani sa nekim ekstremnim dijelovima salefijskog miljea. Asija je pomenula kao dvojicu najuticajnijih propagatora Nusreta Imamovića i Bilala Bosnića, oni su otvoreno zauzimali pronasilni stav kada govorimo o sirijskom ratu. Imamović se 2013. godine pridružio pokretu Al-Nusra, a Bosnić je osuđen na 7 godina zatvora nakon što je proglašen krivim da je održavao govore s ciljem podsticanja pripadnika da se priključe zapravo takozvanoj islamskoj državi. Bosnić bi ove godine trebao dakle izaći iz zatvora. Onome što smo dalje govorili je zapravo djelovanje desničarskih organizacija kroz na neki način ruski utjecaj. U Bosni i Hercegovini zapravo imamo razvijenu mrežu srpsko-ruskih nevladinih organizacija. Kada govorimo o odlascima na strana ratišta, u Bosni i Hercegovini tokom prethodnog rata također smo imali djelovanje ruskih dobrovoljaca koji su u ratu od 1992. do 1995. bili ovdje i svake godine se okupljaju na vojničkom groblju iznad Višegrada gdje se odaje zapravo počast umrlima, poginulima na strani Vojske Republike Srpske. Neki od njih su članovi udruženja dobrovoljaca iz ukrajinske regije Donbas ili noćnih vukova poznatog ruskog motokluba. Firma predsjednika zapravo kluba je povezana direktno sa entitetom Republika Srpska, budući da od njih dobija novac za obavljanje određenih poslova, tačnije izgradnju mini hidrocentrala. Kada govorimo o mreži i ruskom utjecaju u Bosni i Hercegovini, upravo je Republika Srpska mjesto gdje je on najviše vidljiv i tu zapravo imamo mješavinu realne politike i neoevroazijstva na Zapadnom Balkanu. Mi smo mogli vidjeti utjecaj Rusije na izborima, ali i sve agresivniju taktiku kada govorimo o utjecaju na Zapadnom Balkanu. Neko koga možemo smatrati reći saveznik na kojeg se Rusija uvijek može osloniti je upravo Milorad Dodik. On predstavlja člana predsjedništva Bosne i Hercegovine iz reda srpskog naroda. Od 2006. godine zapravo negdje vidimo kako raste taj utjecaj upravo putem Milorada Dodika u Bosni i Hercegovini, gdje se on dakle smatra istinskim, tako reći, prijateljem. Kada govorimo o utjecaju Rusije, možemo reći da ono što Dodik sve vrijeme ističe je da zapravo zapadne zemlje ističu, odnosno šire lažne ideje da postoji negativan ruski utjecaj u Bosni i Hercegovini koji mi, evo kroz razna istraživanja kako Atlantske inicijative, tako i evo Birna koji se dotakao ovih tema u zadnjim godinama vidimo. Tako da to je bio neki osvrt zaključan sa svim ovim panelima i razgovorima koje smo čuli. Ja više nemam pitanja za vas. Ako bi neko imao nešto da doda, molim vas, sada je vrijeme, prije nego što se zahvalim svima. Ništa. Hvala vam svima na učešću. Bilo je zadovoljstvo slušati ove razgovore. Zahvaljujemo se naravno i ambasadi Kraljevine Norveške za financijsku podršku. Hvala Atlantskoj inicijativi na organizaciji ovog webinara, pa se nadam da ćemo se nekad uskoro moći negdje i uživo skupiti i razgovarati o ovim temama. Hvala još jednom i doviđenja.